This special monthly UBU episode on hashtag Black Mental Health is sponsored by Janssen Neuroscience and supported by The Painted Brain, a California peer-run organization. All right, well, welcome back to Unapologetically Black Unicorns. And as usual, I have a fantastic guest, somebody who's here from California. And as we talk about our hashtag Black Mental Health, I think, she makes a perfect guest to talk about her own personal family journey. But why don't I go ahead and let Taun Hall, who is our guest, introduce herself. So hi, Taun, welcome. And why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, hi, Karis. Yeah, thank you so much for having me on today. I really appreciate it and giving me the opportunity to talk about what happened to our family and what happened to my beautiful son, Miles Hall, who was killed by the police on June 2nd, 2019, while experiencing a mental health emergency.
Mm-hmm.
So we basically now have been thrusted into advocacy to make sure that there's changes in the way that people with mental health emergencies are treated. And we really want to make sure we remove the police from that encounter, because some of the things about Miles is just, he was just so beautiful and so kind and thoughtful and caring. And he lived with mental illness, and he lived with mental illness when he was a younger person. And it's been a challenge for him, and it's been a challenge for us to try to support him during his journey throughout his younger days, throughout his older days and young adult days. So we are now just trying to kind of maneuver life without him.
Right, right. Well, I'm so glad you're here. And, of course, sorry that this has happened, but, glad that it's, moved you into action. In my mind, I keep thinking, when we think about mental health and mental health support, especially for, Black folks and young adults and young folk, is how do we meet people where they are, and what kind of things might you have expected? I mean, I was really interested to learn that he liked music. He liked, I think, rap music or hip hop music. And there are, Black support groups that are based on hip hop.
Mm-hmm.
Who knew, right? And, sometimes how might that be of support to someone to meet them where they are in an area of interest that they have? But let's start at the beginning. Tell me a little bit, sort of how things got to the point they got to.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about that?
When he was in school, like, all his teachers just really, really enjoyed him. They would always say at the end of the year, gosh, we really enjoyed him. He was a great kid. They said he was squirrely, he had a lot of energy. But that was also, he was diagnosed with ADD, attention deficit disorder, as a younger child. And when he went into middle school, he was doing really well. And I feel like he kind of found a groove with friends, and he was also on the, when he went into high school, he also was on the basketball team. He played basketball in middle school as well. I feel like he was just thriving. But when I say that, he still had things that I felt like were challenging for him. We really started to notice really big changes when he was about to graduate from high school. And he just didn't have any plans. He didn't have any plans for the future. He didn't see himself going to college or even thinking kind of like further along. And that was kind of surprising, because we live in an area where school is really important. Education is important to us. We've kind of instilled that in him. And that was fine if he didn't want to go to school, but it was just kind of a surprise. And then we were really surprised when he kind of was like, well, God's going to provide for me. And we're not a super religious family. So we were kind of like, okay, that's a different kind of thought and mindset. Okay. So we're like, all right. So when he ended up graduating from high school, he started to like kind of send disorganized texts to like friends and family, but it was just kind of concerning, kind of to see some of the things that he was saying. And it was not, he was always very kind and gentle. It was just more of a disorganized thought process in the way that he was texting.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where it started. And then I was like, okay, well, how can I support Miles? Because we started seeing some of those behaviors. And I tried to get him to go to therapy. He wasn't interested in going to therapy. So I was like, well, I'll go to therapy so I can support him and know how to handle and help him throughout his journey. And I ended up doing that. And I got some tips from the therapist, but it wasn't enough. Miles was at this point, now he's over 18 and now he can make all the decisions for himself. Right. So there's not much I can do to support him. At one point, Miles, he decided he was going to leave our house, and he left like in the middle of the night. He didn't really know anyone. He didn't know where he was going, and he didn't come home that night.
Hmm.
So I was concerned for his safety, and it's kind of hard to explain because Miles was so trusting of others and thought, he was just a very innocent person. But I remember him, finally coming home. We had called a missing persons report out, and we didn't know where he was, and it was scary.
Hmm.
And from that point, I was like, I'm concerned for Miles' safety. He didn't have the mindset that he really was understanding as much.
Were you concerned too that people wouldn't understand him and sort of in how he was communicating and the things that he believed about himself? And that was also scary. Would
Yeah,
that?
yeah. No, I think that definitely kind of played into my concerns. We live in a white area. Miles is African American. I was also, yes, like you said, just concerned of what others not think about him, but just that they might be scared of him or not quite understand. And
Hmm.
he's at this point, he's already gone to some of the neighbors' houses. He's been preaching to them, knocking on their doors, saying he's Jesus. So that was part of why I was concerned, is because he left our house and this behavior started. And then I also had found out about NAMI, National Alliance of Mental Illness. I took their family to family class that kind of taught us more about like what to do with someone who has, it's like mental health like 101, to
Hmm.
teach about like different disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar. And one thing they did say is partner with the local law enforcement. So I did that. I felt like, okay, well, that's a start. So I was just trying to be proactive in the work and trying to get him help,
Hmm.
to try to make sure, for one, if my neighbors were calling the police, they knew, okay, well, this young man has a mental illness, something's going on. Also, we hadn't gotten an official diagnosis of what was happening yet.
Mm.
So we also looked to the police because there's no other way at the moment, if there's someone's not willing to go and get help, is to get a diagnosis. So we
Hmm.
felt it was really important to at least try to get a diagnosis to find out what was going on. So when we did make contact with police, it was only because, like I said, Miles was showing disorganized thoughts. We had the police come to our home, and very kind, thoughtful, considerate. There's never aggression anytime. It was just to make sure the police knew who Miles was.
Right.
He's now diagnosed with what we call schizoaffective disorder.
Hmm.
Schizoaffective disorder causes delusions and hallucinations. It also causes agnosocia, and that's something that where they don't have the same reasoning as you and I.
Hmm.
So he didn't understand that he was sick, even though it was obvious to others, it wasn't obvious to him.
Hmm.
So that's a really kind of a dangerous part of the brain when that doesn't work right,
Hmm.
because he doesn't understand the same things that may be danger, or the reasoning parts are off. So when I realized that too, I understood that it was really critical that we tried to get him help. And we were able to get Miles a successful 5150. And what happened with that is they were able to give him medication in the hospital. That was at Miles's consent. He agreed to that. But when he came back from the hospital, he was like a different person because he had this medication. So it was like light switch went off with night and day. He was wanting to get a job. He wanted to go to school. He wanted to get a girlfriend. So we were so excited for the fact that Miles could live a normal life with medication. That's all he needed. And we were so happy. And so Miles did get a job. He got a job. He started, dating. Well, the time that we were able to get Miles the second 5150, it was very challenging trying to get him help because he has to be a danger to self, danger to others, or gravely ill. So we had to say that Miles potentially He had a pocket knife, and Miles wasn't doing anything with that pocket knife, but he had a pocket knife. We had to say that possibly, this pocket knife could be a danger, even though he wasn't doing anything with a pocket knife. But we had been trying again for like 5 months, 4 months, trying to get him help. And then a couple months later, we start seeing some of the behaviors happening again, where he's thinking he's Jesus, he's knocking on doors. So I had called the non-emergency line the day before Miles was killed, and I just said, "Hey, I'm just starting to see Miles is looks like his mental health is kind of declining. He's knocking on doors again. I just wanted to let you know. He think just in case you get other calls from other people, just want to make sure you guys know that Miles is looking like he's needing some support." And of course, he didn't make any criteria at that moment. There was no help that they could give him. So I called the non-emergency line. Now I had a contact with the police. It was a mental health officer with the police. I contacted her because now we had a relationship. Again, it's just trying to partner, being a partner, like, come on, help support my child, my beautiful son who doesn't even understand he's sick, to get him support. So then the next day, Miles is in a full-blown mental health emergency. He's thinking he's Jesus. He's gardening outside with a neighbor. He has a neighbor, because we have a very close community, that he was working in the garden, and they saw him and he said, "Oh, you might look like you need some help." So they gave Miles a garden tool so he could do what he was doing. But Miles is now in a delusional state, and he thought he was Jesus. He now thought this garden tool was a staff from God, which is very common with someone who's in a hallucinatory state. And so Miles ended up breaking a window in our house, a sliding glass door. So 911 was called by my mother. And so unfortunately, about 15 minutes later, Miles was shot behind our house. 5 officers arrived, and 2 of them shot their guns. The first shot was a beanbag, and then he was shot. After I got to the hospital, I saw the mental health officer now that we had the relationship with, and she told me when I got there, "You did everything right. You were the model family." And I just said, "How can we be the model family when my son is dead?" So I knew at that point that this was my life's work, and that I had to make change, because another family should never have to go with what we had to go through.
Taun, I'm perplexed by this whole thing, and not by anything that you have done, but I
Mm.
think, again, like what you're saying is, how do people understand where there are gaping holes in the system?
Right,
How do people understand that a Black man walking on the street when they're ill and may not be cognizant of the fact that that could land them in trouble, which it shouldn't, right? But
right,
it could. How do people understand the very nature of you all doing the things that you needed to do as a loving family that you would never do if he had cancer? You would never do if he had asthma. You would never do if he had diabetes and he decided, "I don't want to take my diabetes medication," or what have you,
right,
or participate in diabetes treatment. That there is, as much as we say there's parity, or working towards parity, the reality is there isn't parity if your loved one needs help and that help isn't there. You end up having to use people who have nothing to do with the mental health system, police, to come in and help. And I think, you're doing an excellent job of explaining it, and it's very perplexing to me because it's just like so wrong on so many
yeah,
levels.
right.
I'm just shocked that here you are trying to get help, but you have to be ridiculously sick to get that help.
And that's the really, everything's bad, right? I mean, Miles is dead
Yeah,
now. I mean, it's
yeah,
it's bad,
yeah,
right? Like,
yeah.
but the fact of the matter is that, we did work with the police to get him that 5150. So she had all these logs of showing that Miles was having serious mental health challenges, and the fact that they criminalized him. And they also, said that wasn't probably going to happen, like, because they knew he needed a diversion program or something, right? But the
Hmm.
fact that you're charging him they said he resisted arrest, and that he, had possession with a deadly weapon, which is a pocket knife.
Mm.
But Karis, you said it right. The desperation that families have because there is no other way to get help, that's where we were. So it is hard for, I know, Black people and especially to understand, well, why would she call the police? Like that is taboo. You don't do that in a Black community, right? That's something you
Mm-hmm.
just don't do. But I also, I had faith that if I had told them they knew who he was and they saw him as he was, which was gentle and kind, that he would be safe. So I had a false expectation, and that should not be the case.
Yeah, and I mean, I have seen, again, for other people, if for example, a family has a deaf and or a blind child or a child with autism, or even, that when I say child, that can be an adult child too, meaning it's a child of a parent, but it can
Mhm.
be an adult, that the police may know, there may be signs up in the community so that it's known, so that people are aware and then can, interact with some knowledge versus kind of having any kind of fear or accidentally hitting the kid who's deaf and wondering, well, why didn't they hear me? Well, there's a sign there that says the kid is deaf, and or because the family has introduced it as such. So I think there's again, there's this difference in how people with mental health conditions are treated, to the point, as you say, that sadly for you, ends up not only in criminalization but ends up in death, which is, of course, like the worst thing that we would want to have
Right.
happen.
Absolutely.
And that you had this false expectation, because it's like you're doing everything right based on the expectation, but it didn't match kind of the ultimate outcome, sadly. So
Right.
if there's
Yeah.
prevention work, like if we want to look at this from and you were doing everything preventatively, so I feel weird asking the question, like, but what should happen? And especially, in our Black communities, like, what do you wish was available for you and your son that is sans police, as I say, without police? Like, what do you think? And you can, this is like sky's the limit. It doesn't have to be anything that exists today. If you had to make up something that existed, what would it be?
We just needed compassion. We just needed someone
Mm,
to like listen to Miles, to have support, to be there to talk to him, not at a point where we had to be where he had to be a danger to self, danger to others, or gravely ill. So
mm-hmm,
if we had something where those criteria weren't needed, and there was an opportunity like to say, okay, well, maybe there's another criteria, but it's like, delusional or something, right? And just to say there's something different,
mm-hmm,
and we can get Miles help that way.
mm-hmm.
And you didn't have to be so extreme and so what they call extreme, right?
Yes.
To get him help. So if we just had someone to call,
Mm-hmm,
someone to understand his as a peer,
mm-hmm,
to be there with him, to help him and support him,
mm-hmm.
which was what I was trying to do and trying to find, but there was no resources because he was 18 and he didn't understand he was sick. So not, some people who are having a mental health episode or crisis are going to be able to get support because they understand they're ill.
Mm-hmm.
But the danger is when you don't understand you're ill.
Yeah, it's an amazingly sad tragedy. And, I keep thinking about what should have been done or what could have been done, not what should have been done. You were told what should have been done and you did it, right? And
Mhm.
I think, as people are moving into adulthood, us 18-year-olds who move into adulthood, and then suddenly we're an adult and we can, make these decisions about what we want to do, how we want to do it, when we want to do it. I don't know. I'm just going to be honest, Ton. It's hard to hear because it's hard to know. And, for me, quite frankly, to think back on my life, because I have the same diagnosis, right? And so, and people always tell me, oh, you have all this insight. And it's like, well, there was a time where it was like, well, no, that isn't what's going on. That isn't who I am. And I was telling somebody the other day about a long period where I had stopped eating. Like you could look at me now and go, my God, when did she ever stop eating? She's a big girl. But I had literally thought food was poison because that's what the voices and delusions were telling me. Food was poison. And so I had stopped eating and I did not tell my parents what was going on. They kind of knew something was going on and, eventually took me to a therapist to kind of, work through. And I never really said it was the voices and delusions. And so I think it's very hard to think about how to help someone when they're stuck in this belief, and that belief is their life and their truth and their reality. And how do you shake them of that, right?
Yeah,
It's kind of like you kind of can't.
yeah,
But the question then becomes, that doesn't mean that people should be giving up. Like, what more could we be doing? And I
right.
know for me, being able to have someone who looked like me, who had been through many of the same things that I had been through, just to be able to talk to me about those things, so that it became more about something else versus trying to talk me out of my beliefs and delusions. It was more about how to talk me into life, and how for me to see that this person was doing this stuff. And she said, yeah, oh yeah, that's the street that I ran down naked on. And that's where the police picked me up and put me in St. Elizabeth's. And I was like, wait, what? Aren't you a lawyer? She was a
Wow.
lawyer, but this is the story she's telling me. And I'm like, wait a minute. Wait, what? And so that sort of like was like, okay, well, wait a minute. There's this difference. But telling you that took years for that to happen. It didn't happen. It took years. And that's, also why I do the advocacy I do, so that, especially for Black and Brown people, that we can have people who look like us, who've been through what we've been through, because it starts to frame it a little bit differently. It starts to frame it in our cultural understanding. But how you have done this work, I think, really is going to impact so many people, because we actually have a bill here in California that has passed, and it's moving our 988, the mental health crisis line work that the nation has, but it is named after your son. So can you talk a little bit about the California Miles Hall Lifeline and Suicide Prevention Act and 988, and what it is and what it does, and
Yeah,
how people can understand, like, how it can be helpful.
absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for sharing about your story too. I mean, it's very powerful that you're out here doing this work and advocating for so many others. So much appreciated.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Miles Hall Lifeline and Suicide Prevention Act, it's called AB 988. So it's Assembly Bill AB 988, which is in California. And that basically is that people will have another resource to call, right? So if someone is needing help and someone needs assistance, if you're having a mental health emergency, you can call 988, which 988 is the national line. But AB 988 is a little different because it eventually will have crisis counselors that will come to assist. There'll be someone on the other line to help. There'll be a place to go. So if someone needs the care and they're trying to get them stabilized, there's a stabilization center. And it also involves peers, right? So peers are going to also be able to understand and relate. And I think, something like this, like I said, what if we called the day before, right? What if we had 988? What if we had AB 988? If we had AB 988, crisis counselors would have come out. Guess what? They wouldn't have guns. So
Mhm.
Miles would have been an ability to be safe. So that's why it's so important is that
Yeah.
eventually it's not ready yet. It's not meaning that the crisis counselors necessarily aren't in full deploy yet, but some cities and some counties do have mobile crisis units.
Mhm.
But yeah, so it just has the ability to basically have people who are trained instead
Yeah.
of police, people who have thousands of hours in mental health care,
Yeah.
opposed to police officers who might have 15 hours.
Right. Right. And people who don't have a gun,
Right.
or
Most
beanbag or
importantly,
any of that kind of stuff. So
right,
yes.
right.
Yeah.
And that's huge, right? So that's basically we have, our families created the Miles Hall Foundation and the Miles Hall Foundation advocacy. What our mission is to protect families, educate communities about mental illness, and protect those most impacted by excessive use of force by law enforcement. So this
Mhm.
is actually our mission is happening with this Miles Hall Lifeline Act, the fact that there's another alternative so we don't have people with mental health challenges being in a position where police are going to come.
Yeah.
And we cannot have that excessive use of force because it killed my son. And as I'm finding out doing this work, it's killed so many other people just like my son.
Yes.
And, we want to make sure we give those people a voice
Yeah.
and the ability to live and thrive.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And to know you can be safe, and that having a mental illness isn't a I hate to say it this way, but it isn't a death sentence, literally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it is. And I say that all the time. I say that mental illness isn't a crime. We're taking out the criminalization.
Hmm.
We're taking out the possibility of going to jail.
Right.
Just like my son, right? We should have never even had to go to the point where he said, "Oh, we're using the police as a vehicle to get him help." No,
Yeah.
that's dangerous.
Exactly. Exactly. So how can people be get involved in your foundation? Is there a way that people can get involved? We'll put a link in the description, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, follow us on Instagram,
Hmm.
Twitter, Facebook. See the work we're doing as we're growing. We're really trying to make sure that there are safe alternatives for people with mental health challenges.
Right.
And so as we kind of go through this work and the advocacy, it really is to make sure that, like I said, police are not involved in mental health calls.
Right.
And we're also, trying to do some work in the schools as far as the education and breaking the stigma against mental health challenges.
Right. Exactly. So I'll, double down on that with snaps, claps, thumbs up and say, uplift, amplify, share when you're following on any of the social media handles. And so I think this is, just the way to get the word out across not just California, but across the nation. When we have these kind of conversations and you and I, you're doing this work, you're doing it every day, sometimes you have to, retell sort of what's going on. And of course, we have to hear what's going on in the rest of the country. So, how do you take care of your self-care? Because I think this is important when we do this work. It's intensely personal.
Mm.
So, what do you do for your self-care? What does your family do for their own self-care as you're trying to use your story to do the advocacy?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think all of, so I have my husband Scott, who's Miles' dad, and he works a lot and super busy, but I think his things are, he's been playing golf more. I've been trying to get out there and to get some exercise, go to the gym. My daughter, she's also super into like fitness. So that's something she does. And for me, I really spend a lot of time with friends. I take the time to go to lunch, to have coffee. If I can, try to get out there and listen to a concert. Now, those
Hmm.
are my self-care things I love to do.
Awesome.
But one thing I do, my self-care is getting my nails done. I never did that before
Mm,
Miles was killed, and I just started last year. And that's just something that it makes me feel good to look down on my hands and see that they look nice. Also, I would get massages.
oh, wow.
Yeah, so I try to at least get a massage. I would like to get one once a month, but it's turning out to be once a quarter. But just
Mm,
trying to be mindful about that. And then also just be quiet. My
mm,
self-care is being quiet and getting in a quiet space and just letting myself grieve. And it's hard. It's hard to run a foundation that's centered on your son's killing.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's hard. It's
Yeah.
hard. It's hard to talk to you, as
Mm-hmm,
much as I like you and
mm-hmm.
I think you're amazing. It's hard to tell the story.
Yes.
I mean, I'm sure it's hard to hear as an audience.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's important for all of us to have self-care. Take the time to do what makes you feel good
Right.
and separate yourself if you need to, or be around people if you need to.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing. And my self-care thing is, well, among other things, but I like to wear different glasses, which people have noticed that I always have I have about 10 different pairs.
Oh, do you? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, because I don't know, there's just something, it's easy. Like I don't have to worry about are the clothes going to fit? I don't know. The glasses, always. Don't even have to worry about it.
Yeah, no,
So that's my
I was
fun
actually
thing.
looking at them. I was like, oh, these are cool.
Yeah,
They look
yeah.
great.
I try to find different ones that are like fun or, just
Mm-hmm.
different, whatever. So
Fun.
as we wrap up, and I do want to, remind people that, how much they want to share based on if they feel it traumatizes them, then sharing might also traumatize other people. So we do have to be thoughtful about how we share what we share. And I appreciate that, you went through that process and, shared the story so people can have an understanding of what this really looks like. Because I think
Yeah.
a lot of times they hear A and Z and maybe not a lot between A and Z. So
Right.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So if you have one piece of wisdom, this is where we do our wisdom dropping towards the end. If you have one piece of wisdom for our listeners, and again, this is a part of a series, hashtag Black Mental Health. So we're talking about Black people and Black communities,
Mhm.
Black people and Black communities. I'll put it that way. So if you had one piece of wisdom dropping or information you wanted to share with people about their mental health and well-being, what would it be?
I mean, I would just say, just talk about it. Don't isolate. There's someone else just like you who is going through something like you're going through, and you're not going to be alone. And I think that's with the stigma of mental health is that so many people hold it in and they don't tell and they don't talk about it. And that's what I'm really finding out with now that I'm doing this work. People feel it is a safe, I am a safe place to talk about it. And I think that's really important is that we have to break that stigma that mental health is something wrong with us or it's a bad thing, right? So many people are going through what you're going through. So I would just say, talk. Now there's 988. There's other ways you can, get some support. There's so many crisis like hotlines and chat lines. And so I would say there are resources like that. So especially now, I would say that would be a great place to start.
Wonderful. Snaps, claps, thumbs up. Couldn't agree more. That's the purpose of the podcast as well. So people can hear the stories and know they're not alone. And hopefully, even if it's reaching out to somebody that they've heard on the podcast or using 988 or any other resources that are out there, I am just going to double down on your wisdom shared today. So, Taun, thank you so much for joining us on Unapologetically Black Unicorns and sharing your story and doing the work that you're doing on behalf of your son and the rest of the nation. So, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Karis.
All right. Thank you. And so, for our listeners, y'all know what to do. The producer says I need you to like, subscribe, comment. Sorry, producer, I put you out there on that. And yes, that's important to do. But the most important thing to do is to share the podcast episode so that other people can have access to this information that's so important and helpful for folks in the community. So just ask you to share and then to join us next time on Unapologetically Black Unicorns, #Black Mental Health.